The dust had been her companion for 3 days now, swirling up from the wagon wheels and settling into every fold of her traveling dress. Margaret O'Sullivan shifted on the hard wooden seat, her hands gripping the worn leather reins as the tired horses plodded along the rutted trail. The October sun hung low in the Wyoming sky, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. She'd come so far from Boston, following a newspaper advertisement that promised work for educated women willing to teach in the frontier territories. The agency had been specific. A rancher named Samuel Harrison needed a governess for his 3 children. Good wages, room and board included. It had seemed like Providence itself when she'd read those words, sitting in her cramped boarding house room with her last month's rent overdue. The directions from the last town had been simple enough. Follow the creek until you see the split oak. Then head north toward the hills. You'll know the Harrison Ranch by the red barn and the windmill. But that had been hours ago, and doubt gnawed at her like hunger. What if she'd taken the wrong turn? What if the position had already been filled? Margaret squinted against the setting sun and saw it, a windmill's skeletal frame rising against the sky, its blades turning lazily in the evening breeze. Relief flooded through her as she spotted the red barn nearby, and beyond it, a modest 2-story house built of rough-hewn logs. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth against the chill that crept in with nightfall. She guided the rented wagon up the dirt path, her heart hammering beneath her corset stays. This was it, her new beginning, her chance to build something meaningful, far from the suffocating expectations of city life. The horse's hooves crunched on gravel as she pulled up before the house, and she took a moment to smooth her dusty hair and straighten her bonnet. The front door was solid oak, weathered but well-maintained. Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long journey, and approached with what she hoped was confident grace. She raised her gloved hand and knocked firmly, 3 times. Inside, she could hear the scrape of chair legs against floorboards, the murmur of voices, children's voices. Good. At least she hadn't come to an empty house. Footsteps approached, heavy and measured, and the door swung open. The man who stood there was nothing like what she'd expected. Samuel Harrison, for this must be him, was perhaps 40 years of age, with shoulders broad from ranch work and hands that spoke of honest labor. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lines etched deep around eyes the color of prairie storm clouds. Dark hair, touched with early silver at the temples, fell across his forehead. He wore simple work clothes, cotton shirt rolled to the elbows, canvas trousers, suspenders hanging loose at his sides as if he'd been in the middle of some task. But it was the confusion in his expression that caught her attention most. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was deep, tinged with the soft drawl of someone raised in border country. "Can I help you?" Margaret straightened her spine, summoning the speech she'd practiced during the long journey. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison. I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. I've come about the teaching position." She smiled, hoping to ease the bewilderment that seemed to deepen on his face. "The agency in Cheyenne sent me. I was told your children needed a governess." Samuel Harrison stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret felt her confidence begin to waver. Behind him, she could see 3 small faces peering around the doorframe, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from perhaps 6 to 12 years of age. Their clothes were clean but mended, their hair neatly combed. Someone had been caring for them, but there was a quality to their wide-eyed curiosity that spoke of loneliness. "Ma'am," Samuel said slowly, running a hand through his hair, "I think there's been some mistake. I never sent for any governess, haven't had contact with any agency in Cheyenne or anywhere else." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her. She'd spent her last dollar on the train fare and wagon rental. She'd given up her room in Boston, sold most of her possessions, and now... "But," she began, then stopped, swallowing hard. The letter was quite specific. The Harrison Ranch, north of Cedar Ridge, 3 children in need of education. I have it right here. She fumbled in her reticule, pulling out the creased paper that had been her lifeline these past weeks. Samuel took the letter, his calloused fingers gentle with the delicate paper. He read it slowly, his frown deepening. "This is my ranch, sure enough, and these are my children, Thomas, James, and little Sarah. But I swear to you, Miss O'Sullivan, I never wrote this letter, never contacted any agency." "Papa," the smallest child, Sarah, tugged at his trouser leg. She couldn't have been more than 6, with wheat-colored braids and her father's gray eyes. "Is she a teacher, a real teacher?" "Hush now, Sarah," Samuel said gently. But Margaret caught the look that passed over his face, a mixture of sadness and something else. Longing, perhaps. "Please," Margaret said, fighting to keep desperation from her voice. "Is there perhaps another Harrison ranch nearby? Maybe I've come to the wrong place." Samuel shook his head. "No other Harrisons in these parts. Ma'am, nearest neighbor of any name is 5 miles east." He looked at the letter again, then at her dust-covered traveling dress. The weariness she knew must show in her face. "You've come a long way." "From Boston," she admitted, feeling foolish now. How had she not verified the letter more carefully? But the agency had seemed so legitimate, the opportunity so perfect. "Boston," he repeated, something softening in his expression. That's a mighty long journey for a misunderstanding." The boys had crept closer now. The elder, Thomas, she thought, bold enough to stand beside his father. "We used to have lessons," he said suddenly. "When Mama was—" He trailed off, glancing up at Samuel, who had gone very still. "That was different, son," Samuel said quietly. He cleared his throat, looked back at Margaret. "My wife passed 2 years back. She taught the children their letters and numbers. Since then, well, we've managed as best we could." "I can read some," James piped up. He looked to be about 8, with freckles scattered across his nose. "But Tom says I'm slow, and Sarah don't know her letters at all yet." "Doesn't know," Thomas corrected, then flushed as if embarrassed by his own knowledge. Margaret watched this small family, saw the way they clustered together in the doorway of their home, and felt something shift in her chest. They hadn't sent for her, but looking at those eager young faces, she could see they needed her just the same. Mr. Harrison," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I find myself in something of a predicament. I've traveled nearly 2,000 miles on the promise of employment that apparently doesn't exist. I spent my last funds getting here. And now—" She gestured helplessly at the darkening sky. "I don't even know where I might find lodging for the night." Samuel's jaw worked as if he were chewing over a difficult thought. He looked down at his children, then back at her, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Duty against practicality, compassion against caution. "Papa," Sarah whispered, tugging his hand again. "She could teach me my letters, like Mama was going to." The words seemed to break something in Samuel Harrison. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he met Margaret's eyes again, she saw a deep weariness there, the kind that comes from carrying too many burdens for too long. "It's getting dark," he said finally, "and Cedar Ridge is no place for a lady to be finding lodging after nightfall. You'd best come in, Miss O'Sullivan. We'll sort this out somehow." He stepped back, and Margaret felt relief wash over her so powerfully she almost swayed. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I promise I won't impose any longer than necessary." "We'll see," he said, but there was no unkindness in it. "Children, mind your manners. We have a guest." As Margaret stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the Harrison home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing into something larger than just a house. The letter might have been a mistake or a mystery, but looking at those 3 hopeful faces turning up to her like flowers seeking sun, she wondered if perhaps she'd found exactly where she was meant to be. The house smelled of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of stew. It was clean, but spare, with the particular emptiness that comes when a woman's touch has been too long absent. And as Samuel Harrison closed the door against the gathering dusk, Margaret O'Sullivan, tired, dusty, and thoroughly lost, felt for the first time in years that she might have finally found her way home. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the kitchen walls as Margaret sat at the rough wooden table, a bowl of beef stew cooling before her. The children had been sent to wash up for bed, leaving her alone with Samuel Harrison for the first time since her arrival. He sat across from her, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "Miss O'Sullivan," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with his words. "I need to be plain with you. I can't afford a governess. The ranch does well enough to keep us fed and sheltered, but there's no extra for wages, especially not what a Boston-educated lady would expect." Margaret set down her spoon carefully. She'd barely touched the stew, her stomach too knotted with worry to accept food. "I understand. Mr. Harrison, I wouldn't presume to ask for employment when you didn't seek it. If you could perhaps just allow me to stay the night. I'll find my way back to town tomorrow and do what?" His voice was gentle but direct. "You said yourself you spent your last money getting here. How do you figure to get back to Boston or even to Cheyenne?" She had no answer for that. The truth was, she'd burned every bridge in coming here, believing so desperately in the promise of that letter. Pride warred with desperation in her chest. "I'll find work in Cedar Ridge," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Perhaps the hotel's run by Ed Morrison and his wife. They've got 6 daughters, all of them helping out. The mercantile's the same family business, no outsiders needed." Samuel's tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. "Cedar Ridge isn't Boston. Miss O'Sullivan, not many opportunities for educated ladies here." From upstairs came the sound of small feet padding across floorboards, followed by Sarah's high giggle and Thomas's stern, "Hush now, you'll get us in trouble." Margaret found herself smiling despite her circumstances. "They're good children," she said softly. "They are." Samuel's face gentled at mention of his offspring. "Though they're running a bit wild without proper guidance. I do my best, but between the ranch work and trying to keep food on the table." He trailed off, looking toward the stairs. "Thomas is sharp as a tack, already helping with the accounts. James has a good heart but needs direction. And Sarah, she reminded you of her mother," Margaret finished quietly, "when she asked about learning her letters." Samuel's jaw tightened. Elizabeth always meant to start teaching her, said 6 was the perfect age, old enough to sit still but young enough that learning was still play. She had it all planned out, the primer she'd use, the little rhymes for remembering. He took a long drink of coffee. Then the fever came through. Took her in 3 days. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, meaning it deeply. She knew about loss, about plans cut short. "Papa!" James appeared in the doorway, nightshirt hanging loose around his thin frame. "Sarah won't settle. She keeps asking about the teacher lady." Samuel sighed, but Margaret was already rising. "May I?" she asked. "I'm quite used to settling young children. I had 3 younger sisters." He hesitated, then nodded. "If you don't mind." Margaret followed James up the narrow stairs to a small room under the eaves. Sarah was sitting up in her bed, covers pulled to her chin, eyes bright with curiosity. Thomas sat on the edge of his own bed, obviously torn between maintaining his dignity as the eldest and satisfying his own curiosity. "Miss O'Sullivan," Sarah exclaimed. "Have you come to say good night?" "I have indeed," Margaret said, settling on the edge of the small bed. "But good children should be lying down with eyes closed at this hour." "Will you tell us a story?" James asked, climbing into his own bed. "Papa tells us stories sometimes, but he only knows the one about the bear and the one about the cattle drive." Margaret glanced at Thomas. "And what about you too old for stories?" He shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but she caught the hopeful look in his eyes. I don't mind them, he allowed. Well then. Margaret smoothed Sarah's covers, her mind reaching back to Boston evenings when she'd done the same for her sisters. Have you ever heard the tale of the brave princess who tamed the wild horses of the valley? 3 heads shook in unison, and Margaret began to weave the story, her voice falling into the gentle rhythm she'd perfected over years of bedtime tales. She painted pictures with words: the princess with hair like moonlight, the horses that ran like wind across the plains, the courage found in kindness rather than force. By the time she finished, Sarah's eyes were heavy, James was fighting yawns, and even Thomas had relaxed his careful guard. She tucked the covers around each child, surprised by how natural it felt. "Miss O'Sullivan," Sarah murmured sleepily, "will you teach me my letters tomorrow?" Margaret's heart clenched. "We'll see what tomorrow brings. Little one, sleep now." She made her way back downstairs to find Samuel standing by the window, staring out at the darkness. He turned at her approach, and she saw something raw in his expression. "They haven't—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "They haven't had anyone tuck them in like that since Elizabeth." "Mr. Harrison." "Sam," he corrected. "If you're going to be staying the night, might as well dispense with formalities." "Sam, then—" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I know you didn't ask for this situation, but I wonder, might we help each other? I need somewhere to stay until I can find my feet. Your children need education. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement." He turned back to the window. "What kind of arrangement?" "Room and board in exchange for teaching the children. No wages. I couldn't ask that of you. Just a place to stay and food to eat while I figure out my next steps. I could help with household duties too. I notice the mending basket is rather full, and the garden looks like it could use attention before winter sets in fully." "You'd do women's work?" He seemed surprised. "A Boston lady." "I do honest work," Margaret corrected. "I've never been afraid of labor. Mr. Sam, my family wasn't wealthy. I know how to keep house, tend gardens, stretch a meal to feed many mouths." Sam was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he'd refuse. Then he spoke, his voice low. "The children need learning. That's true enough. Thomas should be reading more than just the accounts. James needs discipline in his studies. And Sarah—" He paused. "Sarah needs what her mother would have given her." "I can't replace their mother," Margaret said gently. "No." He turned to face her then, and she saw the weight he carried in every line of his weathered face. "But maybe you could give them what I can't. 3 months. That's what I can offer. Room and board through winter in exchange for teaching. Come spring, you should have figured out your path forward, and the roads will be clear for travel." 3 months. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had now. "That's generous, Sam. Thank you." He waved off her thanks. "Don't thank me yet. Winter here isn't like Boston winter. It's hard, isolated. The snow can trap us for weeks at a time. And the children, they're good, but they're spirited. Might be you'll regret this bargain." "I rarely regret hard work," Margaret said firmly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We'll see. Your room will be the small one at the end of the upstairs hall. Was going to be for Sarah when she got older, but for now she's happy sharing with her brothers. It's not much, just a bed and washstand, but it's private." "It sounds perfect," Margaret said, and meant it. Sam moved to bank the fire for the night, his movements efficient and practiced. "Breakfast is at dawn. We rise early here. Ranch work doesn't wait. You'll take the children for lessons after morning chores. I'll not have them getting soft, thinking book learning means they can shirk their duties." "Of course not," Margaret agreed. "Educated minds and capable hands aren't mutually exclusive." He looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her understanding. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose they're not." As Margaret climbed the stairs to her new room, sparse indeed, but clean and private as promised, she could hear Sam moving about below, checking locks, dousing lamps, the sounds of a house settling for the night, of a man maintaining the patterns that kept his family safe. She sat on the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to feel the enormity of what had happened. This wasn't what she'd planned, wasn't the secure position she'd thought she was traveling to. But looking around the simple room, listening to the soft breathing of children through the thin walls, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. Possibility. 3 months to prove herself useful. 3 months to help these motherless children find their way to learning. 3 months to figure out who she was meant to be in this vast, wild country. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And as Margaret O'Sullivan laid her head on the thin pillow, listening to the Wyoming wind sing around the eaves, she allowed herself to hope that sometimes the wrong road could lead to exactly the right destination. Through her small window, she could see stars scattered across the prairie sky like spilled salt. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine, but tonight she had a roof over her head and a purpose to wake to. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound didn't frighten her as it might have even that morning. She was already beginning to understand the language of this place, the rhythm of survival and stubborn hope that kept families like the Harrisons anchored to the land. And somewhere deep in her heart, a small voice whispered that perhaps she'd been preparing for this moment all her life, not for the glamorous governess position she'd imagined, but for this, a family that needed her as much as she needed them. The house grew quiet, settling into sleep, and Margaret let her eyes drift closed. Tomorrow she would begin earning her keep, proving that the mysterious letter, whoever had sent it, had not been wrong after all. These children did need a teacher, and perhaps their father needed something too, though what that might be, she didn't yet dare to name. The kitchen had been transformed into a makeshift schoolroom. Margaret had pushed the heavy table against the wall and arranged 3 mismatched chairs in a semicircle near the warmth of the cast-iron stove. Morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes that danced above the children's heads as they bent over their work. It had been 2 weeks since her arrival, and already the rhythm of lessons had become as natural as breathing. Thomas worked through arithmetic problems with focused intensity, his pencil scratching against the precious paper Margaret had found in town. James practiced his penmanship, tongue poking out in concentration as he formed careful letters. And Sarah, dear Sarah, traced her alphabet on a slate, singing softly under her breath the rhyme Margaret had taught her. A is for apple, round and red. B is for butter on our bread. Miss Margaret, James looked up, ink smudging his cheek. How do you spell coyote? Sound it out, Margaret encouraged, moving to stand behind him. What do you hear first? As James worked through the word, Margaret caught movement through the window. Sam was training a young horse in the corral, his movements patient and steady as he guided the animal through its paces. She'd noticed how he always positioned himself where he could see the house during lesson time, as if keeping watch over this new addition to his children's lives. Coyote, James attempted. Perfect, Margaret squeezed his shoulder. You're becoming quite the speller. James Harrison. The boy beamed, the praise lighting up his freckled face. These children were so hungry for approval, for the gentle guidance their mother would have provided. Margaret had learned quickly that each child responded differently. Thomas to challenges that pushed his quick mind, James to encouragement that built his confidence, and Sarah to playful songs and stories that made learning feel like a game. Can we read from the book now? Sarah asked, setting down her slate. The one about the pioneer girl. Margaret had discovered a small shelf of books in the parlor, covered in dust but intact. Among them was a collection of stories that had become their daily reward for completed lessons. After Thomas finishes his sums, she said, how many more do you have? Just 2, Thomas replied, but she noticed he was already looking ahead to more complex problems, hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded her of herself at that age. The kitchen door opened, bringing a gust of cold air. And Sam himself, he removed his hat, running a hand through hair dampened with sweat despite the autumn chill. How are the scholars this morning? Papa, Sarah jumped up. I can write my whole name now, want to see? After lunch, sweetheart. Don't want to interrupt your lessons. But he lingered in the doorway, and Margaret felt his presence like a weight in the room. You're welcome to observe, she said quietly. The children might enjoy showing you their progress. Sam hesitated, then moved to lean against the wall, arms crossed. Margaret had noticed he did this sometimes, appeared during lessons on the pretense of getting water or checking the fire, but really watching how his children bloomed under structured learning. Thomas, why don't you explain the problem you're working on to your father? Margaret suggested. The boy straightened, pride evident in his posture. It's about calculating feed portions for the cattle through winter. Papa, Miss Margaret showed me how to figure out daily rations based on head count and expected snow days. Sam's eyebrows rose. Practical mathematics? Everything connects, Margaret said, meeting his gaze. Numbers aren't just abstractions, they're tools for living. James is writing about the ranch for his penmanship practice, and Sarah's learning her letters through words she sees every day. Smart, Sam murmured, and she caught what might have been approval in his tone. Miss Margaret says I could help with the real account books soon. Thomas added eagerly, once I master fractions. That so? Sam looked at Margaret with something unreadable in his expression. You know about keeping books. My father was a clerk, she admitted. I helped with his work from the time I was Thomas's age. Mathematics was always my strongest subject. Mine too, Thomas exclaimed, then flushed at his outburst. Sam's mouth quirked in what was almost a smile. Good to know it runs in the family, then. He straightened, preparing to leave. Don't let me disturb you further. But Sarah had other ideas. Papa, stay for the story. Miss Margaret does voices for all the characters. Sarah, Margaret began, but Sam was already pulling up a chair. One chapter won't hurt, he said gruffly. Been a while since I heard a proper story. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she opened the book. Reading aloud to children was one thing. Performing for their father was quite another. But 3 expectant faces, 4, if she counted Sam's carefully neutral expression, waited for her to begin. She let the story carry her away, as it always did. Her voice shifted for each character, brave young Laura crossing the prairie, Pa with his fiddle and songs, Ma keeping the family together through trials. The children leaned in, transported, and she gradually forgot Sam's presence until Sarah's giggle at a particularly funny part made her glance up. Sam was watching not the book, but his children's faces, and the raw longing in his expression made her voice falter. He was seeing what they could have had. Elizabeth reading to them, the complete family gathered in warmth and safety. She recovered quickly, finishing the chapter. But the moment stayed with her as the children reluctantly returned to their work. Sam escaped back outside, muttering about fence repairs, but not before she caught him wiping roughly at his eyes. Miss Margaret, James tugged at her sleeve. Do you think Papa's sad? The question pierced her heart. Sometimes grown-ups feel many things at once, she said carefully. Happy and sad mixed together, like when you see a beautiful sunset but wish someone special was there to share it. James considered this with the seriousness of 8-year-olds confronting life's complexities. Like how I'm happy you're here, but sometimes miss Mama. Exactly like that, Margaret whispered, pulling him into a quick hug. The rest of the morning passed peacefully. After lessons, the children scattered to their chores. Thomas to help with the horses, James to gather eggs, Sarah to practice her letters while helping Margaret with the noon meal preparation. It was while kneading bread that Margaret heard the humming. Sam had returned to fix a loose board on the porch, and through the open window drifted a melody she recognized. One of the songs from the story, about crossing rivers and building homes. His voice was rough but true, and Sarah picked up the tune from her spot at the table. Papa knows that song, she exclaimed. Your Mama used to sing it, Sam said through the window, not pausing in his work. taught it to me when we were courting. It was the most he'd ever said about his wife voluntarily, and Margaret held her breath, not wanting to break the spell. "Will you teach me the words?" Papa Sarah asked. "Miss Margaret probably knows them better." He deflected, but gently. "We could all learn together." Margaret suggested, "Music helps with memorization. Sarah could practice her letters by writing out the verses." She saw Sam's hand still on the hammer. That's a fine idea," he said quietly. That afternoon, after the heavy work was done, they gathered in the kitchen again. Margaret wrote the song's words on the slate while Sam, with obvious reluctance that gradually eased, sang the melody. The children joined in, voices weaving together, and Margaret felt the threads of something new being spun, not a replacement for what was lost, but perhaps the beginning of what could be. As she watched Sam help Sarah form her letters, patient with her mistakes, she understood that teaching these children was only part of her purpose here. She was helping this family remember how to learn together, how to share moments of joy despite the empty chair at their table. When Sam's eyes met hers over Sarah's head, she saw gratitude there, mixed with something else she didn't dare name. But she also saw fear, the fear of a man who'd lost everything once and didn't know if he could survive it again. "Tomorrow we'll start on the multiplication tables," she said lightly, breaking the moment. "Thomas, you'll help teach James the simpler ones while you work on the harder sets." "Yes, Miss Margaret," Thomas said proudly, already imagining his role as assistant teacher. As the children cleared their slates and put away their materials, Sam lingered. "They're different," he said quietly. "Lighter, somehow, more like before." "Children are resilient," Margaret replied. "They just need the right environment to flourish." "And what about their teacher?" he asked, voice low enough that the children couldn't hear. "What does she need?" The question caught her off guard. I have what I need. A purpose, a roof over my head, eager students." "That all?" His gray eyes held hers, searching. "For now," she managed, though her heart was suddenly racing. "For now, that's everything." Sam nodded slowly, then called to the children to help with evening chores. As the kitchen emptied, Margaret stood alone in the space that had become her classroom, her sanctuary, her unexpected home. Through the window, she watched the Harrison family work together, Sarah skipping between her brothers, Sam's watchful presence keeping them all within the circle of his protection. She'd come here by mistake, following a letter that shouldn't have existed, but watching Thomas explain something to James, seeing Sarah practice writing in the dirt with a stick, catching Sam's small smile at his children's antics. Margaret knew with sudden clarity that she was exactly where she belonged. The teacher they'd never sent for had become the teacher they desperately needed. And perhaps, she thought as she began preparing supper, she'd found something she desperately needed too. A place where her knowledge had purpose, where her presence made a tangible difference, where 3 children's laughter could fill the empty spaces in her own heart. The sun was setting over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. From outside came the sound of Sam's deep voice directing the children, James's excited chatter about finding a particularly large egg, Thomas's careful questions about tomorrow's work, and Sarah's sweet singing of her new letter song. Margaret smiled, wiping her floury hands on her apron. Yes, she was their teacher, but they were teaching her too, about resilience, about finding joy in small moments, about building family from the pieces left after loss. And as she lit the lamps against the gathering dark, she whispered a prayer of thanks for mysterious letters and wrong turns that led to exactly the right place. November arrived with the first serious snowfall, transforming the ranch into a world of white. Margaret woke to find frost patterns on her window and her breath misting in the cold air of her small room. But downstairs, warmth already radiated from the kitchen stove where she'd banked the fire the night before, a skill Sam had taught her with his characteristic patience. 6 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the Harrison household had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The kitchen shelves now held neat rows of preserved vegetables she'd helped put up before the freeze. Curtains she'd sewn from fabric Sam had reluctantly purchased in town softened the windows. The children's clothing showed careful mending, and their faces had lost the pinched look of neglect. "Miss Margaret." Sarah burst through her door without knocking, a habit they were still working on. "Papa says we can make snow angels after lessons if we finish all our work." "After breakfast and chores," Margaret reminded, but she was already smiling. Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, and the child had become her constant shadow when not in lessons. Downstairs, she found Thomas already at the table, reading by lamplight. He'd discovered a passion for books that reminded her painfully of her own childhood hunger for knowledge. Sam had mentioned finding him reading by candlelight after bedtime more than once. "Good morning, Thomas. What has captured your attention today?" "It's about the Roman Empire," he said without looking up. "Did you know they had heated floors? Papa says that's nonsense, but the book explains how they did it with fires underneath." "The hypocaust system," Margaret confirmed, pouring herself coffee from the pot Sam always left ready. "Perhaps we could draw a diagram during lessons today." "Could we?" His face lit up. At 12, Thomas was balanced precariously between childhood and young manhood, eager to prove himself capable but still young enough to show unguarded enthusiasm. James stumbled in, yawning widely. "Is it morning already?" "The sun seems to think so," Margaret said, ruffling his sleep-mussed hair, "though it's taking its time showing itself these days." Sam entered from outside, bringing cold air and the scent of hay. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his cheeks were red with cold. "Horses are fed. Thomas, I'll need your help with the cattle after breakfast. Storm's coming in tonight. Want to move them to the near pasture?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, already closing his book and moving toward his outdoor clothes. "After breakfast," Margaret said firmly. "And after you've had something warm. All of you." Sam raised an eyebrow at her tone but said nothing, settling at the table while she served porridge with dried berries and fresh cream. It had become their pattern. She managed the household and lessons while he handled the ranch work, consulting each other on decisions that affected the children. "Papa, Miss Margaret's teaching us about the Romans," Sarah announced through a mouthful of porridge. "They had heated floors." "So I heard," Sam said, his eyes finding Margaret's with quiet amusement. "Seems our schoolroom's expanding beyond the 3 R's." "A broad education creates well-rounded individuals," Margaret said, then added with a smile, "Besides, understanding history helps us appreciate modern conveniences, like stoves that don't require slave labor to maintain." "Fair point," Sam conceded. He'd grown more comfortable with their expanded curriculum once he'd seen how it captured the children's imagination without interfering with practical skills. After breakfast, the morning fell into its familiar rhythm. Sam and Thomas headed out into the snow. James tackled his arithmetic with determined concentration, and Sarah practiced writing sentences about their daily life. Margaret moved between them, offering guidance and encouragement. "Miss Margaret," James said suddenly, "why don't you have any children of your own?" The question hit unexpectedly, making her hands still on the slate she was cleaning. Well, I haven't married," she said carefully. "Why not?" Sarah chimed in with 6-year-old directness. "You're pretty and nice, and you make good biscuits." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, dear one. Sometimes life takes us down different paths than we expect." "Like coming here instead of where you meant to go?" James asked, perceptive as always. "Exactly like that," she agreed. "And I'm very glad for this particular unexpected path." "Me too," Sarah said, abandoning her writing to wrap her arms around Margaret's waist. "I love you, Miss Margaret." The words struck Margaret like lightning. She'd been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, to remember she was temporary, But Sarah's easy affection had worn through her defenses like water through stone. "I love you too, sweetheart," she whispered, returning the embrace. When she looked up, Sam stood in the doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, an unreadable expression on his face. How long had he been there? "Fence wire snapped in the north field," he said gruffly. "Thomas is finishing with the cattle. I'll be back before dark." He left without waiting for response, and Margaret tried to ignore the sting of his abruptness. She'd noticed he did this sometimes, withdrew just when things felt too comfortable, too much like family. The afternoon brought the promised snow angels, with even Thomas condescending to join his siblings in the fresh powder. Margaret watched from the porch, laughing as James somehow managed to create what looked more like a snow demon than an angel. "Miss Margaret, come make one," Sarah called. "Oh, I couldn't. Please." 3 voices joined in chorus, and Margaret found herself being pulled into the snow, her dignified Boston propriety dissolving in the face of their joy. She lay back in the cold powder, moving her arms and legs as the children instructed, their laughter bright as bells in the winter air. When she stood, careful of her skirts, she found they'd positioned her between their own angels, creating a line of 4 snow figures holding hands. "Look," James said softly, "it's like we're a real family." The words hung in the air, crystalline as the snow around them. Margaret felt her throat tighten, unable to speak. "We are a real family," Thomas said firmly. "Maybe not the regular kind, but real enough." That evening, with the storm Sam had predicted howling outside, they gathered in the parlor, a room rarely used since Elizabeth's death, but one Margaret had slowly been reclaiming. She'd built up the fire and lit the lamps, creating a warm cave against the wild weather. The children worked on quiet activities, Thomas reading, James drawing pictures of horses, Sarah practicing her letters on a slate. Margaret sat mending, the domestic scene so peaceful it made her heart ache. Sam occupied his usual chair, supposedly reviewing accounts, but she'd caught him watching them over his ledger more than once. "Miss Margaret," Sarah said suddenly, "will you teach me to sew? I want to make something for my doll." "Of course. Come here, and I'll show you a simple stitch." As she guided Sarah's small fingers through the basic movements, Margaret became aware of Sam setting aside his work. He moved to the fireplace, adding another log, then surprised them all by pulling out something from behind the mantel, a worn fiddle case. "Papa," James exclaimed, "you're going to play." "Been too long," Sam said quietly. "Your mother always said a house needed music to be a home." He tuned the instrument with practiced movements, and Margaret realized this had been another casualty of his grief, this music that clearly lived in his bones but had been silenced by loss. The first notes were hesitant, but as his fingers remembered their skill, the melody strengthened. It was a simple tune, sweet and longing, and Margaret recognized it as one she'd heard him humming while working. "That's Mama's song," Sarah whispered, her sewing forgotten. "One of them," Sam agreed, not stopping his playing. "She had dozens, always filling the house with music." As he played, the children began sharing memories, small things Margaret had never heard before, how their mother would dance while cooking, how she'd make up silly songs for chore time, how she'd insisted on evening concerts where everyone had to perform something, even if it was just clapping rhythm. Margaret listened, understanding that this was what had been missing, not just the practical care she provided, but this, the sharing of memory, the acknowledgement of what was loved and lost. Sam's music had unlocked something they'd all been holding too tight. When the song ended, Sarah climbed into her father's lap. "Play the happy one, Papa, the one about the dancing bear." A smile, a real smile, crossed Sam's face. "You remember that one?" He launched into a lively jig that had James jumping up to demonstrate the silly dance that apparently went with it. Soon all 3 children were dancing, even dignified Thomas, and Margaret found herself clapping along, laughing at their antics. The storm raged outside, but inside was warmth and light and something that felt dangerously close to happiness. "Dance with us, Miss Margaret," Sarah demanded, grabbing her hands. Margaret let herself be pulled into their circle, spinning with the children as Sam's fiddle sang. She caught his eye over Sarah's head and saw something there that made her heart skip. Not just gratitude, not just approval, but recognition. Recognition that this moment, this fullness, was what they'd all been missing. When exhaustion finally claimed the dancers, they collapsed in giggling heaps. Sam set aside his fiddle, and Margaret noticed his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Time for bed, little dancers," she said gently. "Will you tuck us in, Miss Margaret?" Sarah asked. "And Papa, too." It was the first time such a request had been made, both parents, as it were, participating in the bedtime ritual. Sam looked uncertain, but Margaret nodded encouragingly. "If your father has time," she said carefully. "I have time," he said quietly. They climbed the stairs together, the children chattering about the evening, about the storm, about tomorrow's lessons. As Margaret and Sam moved between the beds, adjusting covers and receiving goodnight kisses, she felt the profound rightness of the moment. "Papa," James said sleepily, "I'm glad you played music again." "Me too, son," Sam said softly. "Me too." In the hallway afterward, they stood awkwardly, aware that something had shifted. The house felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been since her arrival. No, alive in a way it hadn't been since before. "Thank you," Sam said roughly, for letting them remember her, for making it safe to remember. "They need their memories," Margaret said, "and so do you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he might say more, but the moment passed, and he merely nodded before heading to his own room. Margaret lay awake listening to the storm, thinking about snow angels and fiddle music and the way a house becomes a home. She'd done what she'd set out to do, brought learning back to the children, order to the household, stability to their days. But somewhere along the way, something more had happened. They'd become what James had seen in the snow, a family, unconventional perhaps, but real. And Margaret, who'd arrived by mistake, who was supposed to be temporary, found herself praying to whatever power had sent that mysterious letter. "Let me stay," she whispered to the storm. "Let this be home." Because she understood now what Sam had played in that first haunting melody. Not just loss, but hope. Not just ending, but beginning. And in a house where music had returned, where children danced and memories were treasured rather than buried, anything seemed possible. Even love, even forever, even a family made not by blood but by choice, by chance, by the strange providence that sometimes delivers us not where we intend to go, but exactly where we need to be. The December wind rattled the windows as Margaret added another log to the parlor fire. The children had been asleep for hours, but she'd been restless, unable to settle with her mending or the book she'd borrowed from the small collection. Sam had gone to check on the horses one last time before bed, a nightly ritual that sometimes stretched longer than necessary. She'd noticed, especially on evenings when the domestic peace seemed too intense. She heard his boots on the porch, the careful way he knocked snow from them before entering. He appeared in the parlor doorway, obviously surprised to find her still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, moving toward the fire. "Too much coffee at supper, I think," she said, though that wasn't quite true. "How are the horses?" "Settled. This cold's hard on them." He held his hands toward the flames, and she noticed the redness of his knuckles, the wear of constant work. Storm should blow through by morning. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the wind and the crack of burning wood. These quiet moments had become more frequent times when the children's needs didn't demand attention, when they could simply exist in the same space without words. "Margaret," he said suddenly, then stopped. She looked up at his use of her first name without the miss. He'd done it only a handful of times, usually in moments of strong emotion. "I've been thinking about Christmas," he continued, still staring at the fire. "The children haven't had a proper one since, well, I'd like this year to be different." "Of course," she said softly. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't rightly know. Elizabeth always handled the festivities. She'd bake for days, decorate with pine boughs and ribbons. There'd be small gifts, nothing fancy, but wrapped pretty. Church on Christmas Eve, then stories and songs after." His voice roughened. "I haven't had the heart for it." Margaret set aside her mending, moving closer to where he stood. "We could do some of that. The children would love it. I noticed there's a good stand of pine behind the barn. We could cut boughs for decorating. And I saw ribbons in the mercantile last time I was in town." "You'd do that." He turned to look at her then, and the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. "Take on more work for a holiday that isn't even yours to spend with us." The words hung between them, a reminder of her temporary status, of the fact that her 3-month arrangement would end just after the new year. They'd both been careful not to mention it, but the knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. "Sam," she said carefully, "these children have they're very dear to me. Of course I want to give them Christmas." "Just the children?" The question slipped out, followed immediately by a look of horror at his own boldness. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No," she interrupted, her heart racing. "Not just the children." They stared at each other across the small space, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Margaret felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice, one step away from falling into something irreversible. Sam took that step for both of them. His work-roughened hand reached out, fingertips barely brushing her cheek. "Margaret," he said again, and this time her name sounded like a prayer. "I shouldn't feel this," he whispered. "It's too soon, Elizabeth hasn't even been gone 2 years. What kind of man—" "A good man," Margaret interrupted, catching his hand and holding it against her cheek. "A man who's done his best to keep his family whole. A man who's allowed his heart to heal enough to feel again." "When you leave," he began, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. "Must we speak of leaving tonight?" He caught her hand, holding it gently. "You're right. Tonight I just want to tell you that having you here has changed everything. The children are thriving. The house feels alive again. And Sam, I find myself looking for you," he admitted. "During the day, when I'm working, I'll think of something to tell you. Some small thing the children did or said. I hurry through evening chores to get back to the house. To see you all gathered in the kitchen or parlor, it feels like home," Margaret finished softly. "Real home." "Yes." The word came out rough with emotion. "And I'm terrified of losing that again, of watching you pack your bags and disappear down that road, leaving us emptier than before." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Do you think it would be easy for me leaving?" She pulled her hand free, needing distance to say what must be said. "I came here by accident, following a position that didn't exist, but somewhere in teaching the children their letters and mending clothes and making meals, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for." "What's that?" "A place where I'm needed, not just useful, but necessary, where my presence matters." She wrapped her arms around herself. "In Boston, I was one of thousands of educated women scrambling for positions. Here, I'm Miss Margaret, who makes Sarah laugh and helps Thomas understand history and gives James confidence in himself." "You're more than that," Sam said quietly. "You're the woman who brought music back to this house, who made it safe for us to remember joy, who looks at my children like they're precious to you." "They are precious to me," she whispered. "And their father?" The question hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Margaret met his eyes, letting him see the truth she'd been hiding for weeks. Him too, especially him. Sam crossed the space between them in 2 strides, but then stopped, uncertainty replacing determination. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Court a woman while my children sleep upstairs, while she lives under my roof. Elizabeth and I were young. Everything was simple. This is complicated," Margaret agreed. "But Sam, the best things often are." He reached out again, this time taking both her hands in his. They stood that way, connected but careful, aware of all the reasons this shouldn't happen and equally aware that it already had. "I need to say something," Sam said finally, "about Elizabeth." Margaret tensed, but he held her hands firmly, gently. "I loved my wife, loved her with everything a young man had to give. When she died, I thought that part of me died too. Thought it should stay dead. Out of loyalty or respect or, I don't know, punishment, maybe, for failing to save her." "Sam, no. Let me finish. You've helped me see that loving again doesn't diminish what Elizabeth and I had. She wouldn't want this," he gestured at the house around them, "this half-life we've been living. She'd want her children to have laughter and learning and a mother's care. She'd want me to be more than a ghost wandering through my own life." "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Margaret said softly. "She was, and I think she would have liked you. Liked how you've brought her children through their grief. Liked how you've made them excited about life again." He paused, thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Liked how you've done the same for me." Margaret felt tears spill over then, unable to hold them back. "I wish I could have known her, could have asked her permission, in a way, to love what she loved." "You don't need permission to love," Sam said. "But if you did, I think you'd have it. From her, from the children, from me." The word hung between them. Love, not affection or fondness or attraction, but love. The thing that had been growing between them like a plant reaching toward sunlight, inevitable and necessary. "I do, you know," Margaret said, barely above a whisper. "Love, all of you." Sam released her hands only to frame her face gently, tilting it up toward his. "May I?" he asked, and she nodded, unable to speak. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and answer all at once. It tasted of coffee and promises, of winter nights and spring possibilities. When they parted, Margaret saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Sam smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Now we give the children the best Christmas they've had in years. We get through winter. And we stop pretending you're leaving come January." "Sam, we should be practical." "Practical." He laughed, actually laughed, and the sound filled the room like music. "Margaret O'Sullivan, nothing about this has been practical from the moment you knocked on my door. A mysterious letter. A woman from Boston teaching ranch children. A family putting itself back together through pure, stubborn hope. Where's the practicality in any of that?" She found herself laughing too, giddy with the absurdity and rightness of it all. "You have a point. I have more than a point. I have a question." He grew serious again. "Will you stay not as the governess, not as a temporary solution, but as whatever we're brave enough to call this? The children already love you like a mother. You know that. The neighbors will gossip regardless. Let them. Your memories will always be part of me, but they don't have to be all of me." He pulled her close, and she let herself lean into his strength. "Stay, Margaret. Help me raise these children. Help me run this ranch. Help me remember what it feels like to be fully alive." Margaret thought of her cold room in Boston, of the endless struggle for respectable employment, of the loneliness that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a position that didn't exist. Then she thought of Sarah's laughter, James's eager questions, Thomas's quiet pride in his achievements, of kitchen lessons and evening stories, and a house filled with warmth against the winter cold, of this man who'd lost everything and still found the courage to hope again. "Yes?" she said simply. Yes, I'll stay. Sam's arms tightened around her, and she felt him shudder with relief or emotion or both. They stood wrapped in each other as the storm gradually quieted outside, as the fire burned lower, as the house settled around them with the small sounds of sleeping children and endless possibility. Tomorrow would bring questions and plans and difficulties to navigate. But tonight, in the circle of Sam's arms, Margaret allowed herself to fully feel what she'd been fighting for weeks, the absolute certainty that she was home, not the home she'd planned or expected, but the one shaped by mystery and accident and grace, the one where she belonged. January brought the worst blizzard anyone could remember. For 3 days, the world beyond the windows disappeared into a wall of white, the wind howling like a living thing trying to tear the house from its foundations. Sam had barely made it back from the barn after the morning feeding when the full force of the storm hit. "We're going to lose the chickens," he said grimly, ice crystals still clinging to his beard. "Coop's not built for this kind of cold." Margaret looked up from where she was helping Sarah with her letters, the kitchen warm and lamplit against the storm's fury. "What about bringing them into the barn?" "Too dangerous to try now. Can't see 3 feet past the door." "Then we bring them here," Margaret said decisively. "The mudroom's cold but protected. We can manage for a few days." Sam stared at her. "You want to bring chickens into the house? Would you rather lose them?" She was already moving, gathering old blankets. "Thomas, James, help me prepare the mudroom. Sarah, you'll help me carry the smaller hens." "Margaret, it's madness to go out in this." "Then it's madness we do together," she interrupted. "We can string a rope from the porch to the coop. No one goes off the rope. We make multiple trips, save what we can." For a moment, Sam looked like he might argue. Then something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, that she wasn't just a guest in his home anymore, but a partner in its survival. "Thomas, get the rope from the barn supply," he ordered. "James, help Miss Margaret with those blankets. We'll do this proper-like." What followed was 2 hours of controlled chaos, with the rope as their lifeline. They made trip after trip through the blinding snow, carrying squawking, panicked chickens into the house. Margaret's hands went numb despite her gloves, and more than once the wind nearly knocked her from her feet. But Sam's strong hand was always there, steadying her, guiding her back to safety. Sarah proved surprisingly helpful, gentle with the frightened birds, crooning to them as she settled them into the makeshift coop they'd created. By the time they rescued the last hen, all 5 of them were soaked, frozen, and exhausted, but triumphant. "We did it," James crowed, dancing around the mudroom despite his chattering teeth. "We saved them all." "Most of them," Sam corrected, but he was smiling. "Good thinking. Margaret, quick and smart." "Mama would have done the same," Thomas said quietly, and everyone stilled. It was the first time any of the children had compared Margaret to their mother directly. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman," Margaret said carefully, meeting Sam's eyes over Thomas's head. "I hope I can live up to her example." "You already do," Thomas said simply, then flushed and hurried to help James secure the temporary coop. That night, as the storm raged on, Margaret found herself battling more than weather. Sarah had developed a cough during the day that worsened as evening fell. By midnight, the little girl was burning with fever, her breathing labored and painful. "It's the lung fever," Sam said, fear stark in his eyes as he held his daughter. "Same as—" He didn't finish, but Margaret knew. "Same as Elizabeth." "No," she said firmly. "We're not going to let that happen. Thomas, I need you to keep the fire hot. James, bring all the clean cloths you can find. Sam, we need to make a tent over her bed with sheets. The steam will help her breathe." "How do you know?" "My youngest sister had weak lungs. We dealt with this every winter." Margaret was already moving, grateful for the knowledge born of necessity. We need willow bark tea for the fever, steam for the congestion, and constant watching. For 3 days, as the blizzard trapped them inside, they fought for Sarah's life. Margaret barely slept, maintaining the steam tent, spooning tea and broth into the child, keeping her propped up to ease her breathing. Sam never left his daughter's side except when Margaret physically pushed him to rest, and even then, he only dozed in the chair by her bed. The other children helped without being asked, Thomas keeping water boiling, James entertaining Sarah with quiet stories during her lucid moments. The house took on the hushed quality of a sick room, everyone moving softly, speaking in whispers. On the 3rd night, Sarah's fever spiked dangerously high. She tossed and moaned, calling for her mother, and Sam broke down completely. "I can't lose her too," he wept, clutching Margaret's hand. "I can't do this again." "You won't," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "We won't let her go." She bathed Sarah with cool cloths, sang the lullabies her own mother had sung, prayed with fierce determination to any power that might be listening. At some point, she was never sure when her prayers shifted from "let this child live" to "let our daughter live." The possessive pronoun came naturally, without thought, but Sam heard it. His tear-filled eyes met hers across Sarah's fevered form, and something passed between them, an understanding that whatever happened, they would face it as one. Near dawn, as the storm finally began to quiet, Sarah's fever broke, her breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep. Margaret nearly collapsed with relief, and Sam caught her, holding her as she shook with exhaustion and delayed fear. "You saved her," he whispered into her hair. "You saved my baby girl." "We saved her," Margaret corrected. "All of us, together." When Sarah woke hours later, weak but clear-eyed, her first word was, "Mama," but she was looking at Margaret when she said it. Margaret's heart stopped. She glanced at Sam, unsure how to respond, but he nodded slightly. "I'm here, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. "I'm right here." Sarah smiled and drifted back to sleep, her small hand clutching Margaret's. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed under feet of snow, but inside the Harrison house, a different transformation had taken place. The crisis had crystallized what they'd all been dancing around for months. They weren't playing at being a family anymore. They simply were one. As neighbors dug out and life slowly returned to normal, word spread about how the new governess had saved the Harrison chickens and nursed little Sarah through lung fever. Women who'd been standoffish began stopping by with preserved goods and offers of help. Men nodded respectfully to Sam, mentioning how lucky he was to have found such a capable woman. "They think we're courting," Sam told Margaret one evening as they watched the children play in the snow. Sarah bundled up but recovered, her brothers protective as hawks around her. "Aren't we?" Margaret asked with a small smile. "Seems backwards, doesn't it, living like family before the courting's properly done?" "Nothing about us has been proper from the start," she reminded him. "Why begin now?" He laughed, pulling her closer on the porch bench. "Fair point, though I'd like to do right by you. Margaret, make it official. Proper-like. You deserve that." "What I deserve," she said, "is what I have: a home, children who need me, a man who sees me as a partner. The rest is just paperwork." "Important paperwork," he argued. "The kind that says you belong here permanent, that no one can question your place." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Is that your way of proposing, Sam Harrison?" He flushed but met her gaze steadily. "Maybe it's my way of working up to it. Man wants to do these things right, especially when it matters." "It all matters," Margaret said softly. "Every day, every small moment. Sarah calling me Mama, Thomas asking my opinion on the accounts, James trusting me with his fears, you trusting me with your heart. That's what matters." "My practical Boston woman," Sam murmured. "Always seeing to the heart of things." "Not so practical," she admitted. A practical woman would have verified that employment letter, would have turned back when she found it was false, wouldn't have fallen in love with a grieving rancher and his 3 children in the middle of Wyoming winter. Thank God for impractical women, then, Sam said, and kissed her there on the porch in full view of anyone who might pass by. Spring was still months away, but watching her children, and they were hers now, by choice and love, if not yet by law, Margaret felt the stirring of new growth anyway. They'd weathered the storms, literal and figurative. They'd faced the threat of loss and emerged stronger. The chickens had long since been returned to their repaired coop, but James still told the story of their rescue to anyone who'd listen. Thomas had taken to calling her Ma when he forgot to be formal, and Sarah, precious Sarah, was learning to write Mama Margaret in her careful, looping script. "You know what I think?" Sam said suddenly. "What's that?" "I think that letter, the one that brought you here, I think Elizabeth sent it." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Sam, I know it sounds fanciful, but think about it. A letter that shouldn't exist, bringing exactly the right person at exactly the right time. A woman who could teach the children, heal the house, save my daughter using knowledge learned from her own sister's illness." He shook his head. "That's more than coincidence." Margaret considered this, watching snowflakes drift lazily from the sky. "Perhaps some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries," she said finally. "What matters is that I'm here now." "And staying," Sam added firmly. "And staying," she agreed, linking her arm through his. From inside came the sound of laughter. Thomas had apparently said something that sent James and Sarah into giggles. The sound was bright and alive, filling the winter air with warmth. Home, Margaret thought. Not the home she'd planned or expected or thought she deserved, but home all the same, built from courage and necessity, strengthened by trials, blessed by love. And as Sam drew her inside to join their children, Margaret sent up a prayer of thanks to whatever providence, earthly or otherwise, had guided her to that wrong door on that October evening. Sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in mystery, delivered by mistake, revealed through trial. Sometimes you had to lose your way completely to find exactly where you belonged. The first crocuses pushed through the melting snow in late March, purple and white promises dotting the yard. Margaret knelt beside Sarah in the garden plot, both of them with dirt under their fingernails, planning the spring planting. "Mama Margaret, can we plant flowers too, not just vegetables?" Sarah asked, her small hands patting soil around the seed potatoes. "Of course we can. What kind would you like?" "The yellow ones Mama used to grow. Papa knows the name." Margaret's heart squeezed as it always did when the children mentioned Elizabeth. But now it was a gentle ache, not the sharp fear of comparison it had once been. "We'll ask him at supper." The sun was warm on her back, the kind of spring day that made winter seem like a distant dream. From the corral came the sound of Sam and Thomas working with a young horse, their voices carrying on the clean air. James was in the barn, proudly tending to the new calf he'd helped deliver the week before. This was her world now. Not the cramped rooms of Boston, but this wide sky, this good earth, these people who had become her everything. "Margaret," Sam's voice called from the corral. "Could you come here a moment?" She stood, brushing dirt from her apron, and made her way over with Sarah skipping alongside. Sam stood beside the fence, his hat pushed back, that particular look on his face that meant he was wrestling with something important. "Thomas, take your sister to wash up for lunch," he said, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken. He wanted to speak privately. When the children were gone, Sam took her hand, his own trembling slightly. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he began, then stopped, laughing nervously. "I had a whole speech planned." "Did you?" She couldn't help smiling at his discomfort. This man who faced down blizzards and broke wild horses was undone by words. "I did. About how you came here by mistake but turned out to be no mistake at all. About how you've brought life back to this place, to us. about how I can't imagine tomorrow without you, let alone all the tomorrows after that. He fumbled in his pocket, producing a small leather pouch. But standing here now, all I can think to say is that I love you, and I'm asking if you'll marry me. He opened the pouch, revealing a simple gold band with a small pearl at its center. It was my mother's, he said quickly. She gave it to me before she passed, said to save it for a woman who could make a home anywhere she planted her feet. I think she would have meant you. Margaret looked at the ring, then at this man who'd learned to love again despite his fear, who trusted her with his children and his heart. The spring breeze carried the scent of new growth and possibility. Sam Harrison, she said, her voice not quite steady. Are you proposing to me in a corral? He glanced around as if just realizing their surroundings, then laughed. I am, though if you need somewhere fancier. No, she interrupted, stepping closer. This is perfect. This is us, real and honest and exactly right. She held out her left hand. Yes, Sam. Yes to all of it. To you, to the children, to whatever comes next. His hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, the pearl catching the sunlight. Then he was kissing her, there in the muddy corral with horses looking on and chickens pecking nearby. And it was absolutely perfect. Papa's kissing Mama Margaret. Sarah's delighted shriek broke them apart. The children had obviously been spying from the barn door. Does this mean she's staying forever? James asked, bouncing on his toes. If she'll have us, Sam said, his arm around Margaret's waist. Forever, Margaret confirmed, and found herself engulfed in a tangle of arms as all three children launched themselves at the couple. Can we call you Ma now, without the Margaret part? Thomas asked when they'd all settled down. At 13, he was trying to be dignified about his excitement and failing utterly. I'd be honored, Margaret said, blinking back tears. That evening, as word spread through their small community, neighbors began stopping by. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch brought a cake. Old Mr. Green offered to play fiddle at the wedding. The minister's wife promised to organize the church ladies for the reception. Seems the whole valley's been waiting for this. Sam murmured to Margaret as they accepted congratulations. Longer than we were, apparently, she replied, squeezing his hand. Later, after the visitors had gone and the children were in bed, Margaret and Sam sat on the porch planning their future. The wedding would be simple. They decided. A morning ceremony at the church, reception at the ranch. Nothing fancy, but meaningful. I want to adopt the children, Margaret said suddenly. Legally. I mean, so there's never any question that I'm their mother. Sam's eyes misted. You already are, in every way that counts. I know, but I want it official. Want them to know that I chose them, claimed them, same as they've claimed me. We'll see the lawyer next time we're in town, Sam promised. Make it all proper and legal. They talked about practical things, expanding the garden, perhaps adding another room to the house in time. Thomas's education and whether he might want to attend the academy in Cheyenne for his final years of schooling. But underneath the practical ran a current of joy, of rightness, of pieces finally falling into place. I've been thinking, Margaret said as the moon rose full and bright, about that letter, the one that brought me here. Oh, I never tried to find out who really sent it. Never went back to the agency to investigate. It seemed, I don't know, like looking too hard might break the spell. Sam was quiet for a moment. You want to know now? No, she said softly. No, I don't. Some things are better left a mystery. A gift horse, as they say. Speaking of horses, Sam said with a grin, I have a wedding present for you. Been saving her for the right moment. He led her to the barn, where in a back stall stood a beautiful bay mare with intelligent eyes and a white star on her forehead. She's gentle but spirited. Thought you might like to learn to ride. See more of the ranch. Maybe help with the smaller livestock. Margaret stroked the mare's soft nose. overwhelmed. In Boston, horses had been for the wealthy, for people who didn't have to walk everywhere. She's beautiful. What's her name? That's for you to decide. She's yours. Margaret thought for a moment. Hope, she said finally. I'll call her Hope. Perfect, Sam agreed, understanding the significance. As they walked back to the house, Margaret's ring caught the moonlight, sending small sparkles across the yard. In 6 weeks, she'd be Margaret Harrison. The children would legally be hers. The life she'd stumbled into by accident would be hers by choice and law and love. No regrets, Sam asked as they reached the porch. How could I regret the best wrong turn of my life? Margaret replied. Inside, the house waited, warm and welcoming, filled with the sleeping breaths of children and the lingering scent of the evening's celebratory meal. Their house, their children, their life. Tomorrow would bring wedding preparations and spring planting and all the wonderful chaos of a family making its way forward together. But tonight, Margaret stood with her soon-to-be husband and looked out over the land that had become home. Thank you, she whispered to whatever force had sent that letter, had guided her to this door, had given her the courage to stay when everything seemed uncertain. The Wyoming wind sang through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in its voice, Margaret could have sworn she heard an answer, soft and feminine and deeply satisfied. But perhaps that was just fancy, just the romantic notions of a woman in love. Or perhaps, she thought as Sam drew her inside to the warmth and light of home, some gifts were simply too precious to question, some journeys too perfect to map, some love stories too unlikely to be anything but destiny. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, keeping in the warmth. And in a ranch house that had once known terrible loss, joy put down roots as strong and deep as the cottonwoods by the creek, promising shade and shelter for all the seasons to come. The morning of May 15th dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline sky that only Wyoming could produce. Margaret stood before the mirror in Mrs. Patterson's spare room, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The simple white dress, borrowed and altered to fit, made her look younger somehow. Or perhaps it was the joy that seemed to shine from within. Hold still, Mrs. Patterson commanded, pinning orange blossoms from her own greenhouse into Margaret's hair. There, pretty as a picture. Through the window, Margaret could see the church filling with neighbors and friends. It seemed the entire valley had turned out for the wedding of Sam Harrison and his mysterious governess who'd appeared from nowhere and made herself indispensable. Mama Sarah burst through the door in her new yellow dress, the one Margaret had sewn with such care. Papa says it's almost time, and James got dirt on his good shirt already, and Thomas is trying to clean it but making it worse. Margaret laughed, the sound bright and free. Tell them I'll be there in just a moment. This was her life now, managing 3 children's crises, soothing worries, solving problems with patience and love. She wouldn't have it any other way. The church was simple, whitewashed boards and clear glass windows, but someone had decorated it with wildflowers and ribbons. As Margaret walked down the aisle on Mr. Patterson's offered arm, she saw Sam waiting at the altar, tall and strong in his best suit, his gray eyes bright with emotion. The children stood with him, Thomas trying to look grown up and solemn, James fidgeting with barely contained excitement, Sarah beaming and waving despite Thomas's attempts to quiet her. Her family, her home. Reverend Mills spoke about providence, about doors that close only so others can open, about love that comes when least expected but most needed. Margaret barely heard the words, lost in Sam's eyes, in the feeling of his calloused hands holding hers, in the rightness of this moment. Do you, Margaret O'Sullivan, take this man and his children into your heart, to love and cherish, in good times and hard, in plenty and in want, as long as you both shall live? I do, she said, voice clear and certain. When Sam kissed her, the church erupted in cheers. James whooped. Sarah clapped, and even dignified Thomas grinned wide enough to split his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Mills announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Harrison and family." And family, those two words meant everything. The reception at the ranch was a joyful chaos. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by neighbor women. Mr. Green's fiddle sang dancing tunes while children ran between the adults' legs. The spring air carried laughter and music across the prairie. "Happy?" Sam asked, spinning Margaret in a waltz on the makeshift dance floor they'd created in the yard. "Beyond words," she replied, then laughed as James cut into dance with his new mother, standing on her feet like she'd taught him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret found herself standing with Sam on the porch, watching their guests enjoy themselves. Thomas was deep in conversation with the schoolmaster from town about advanced mathematics. Sarah was teaching the other young girls her letter song. James was showing off his calf to anyone who would listen. "We should tell them," Sam said quietly. Margaret placed a hand over her still flat stomach, the secret they'd discovered just days before the wedding. Tonight's for celebrating what is," he decided. "We'll share what's to come when you're ready." She leaned into his strength, this man who'd learned to embrace the future without forgetting the past. In the garden, Elizabeth's daffodils bloomed bright and cheerful, a blessing from one mother to another. Old Mrs. Chen from town approached with a wrapped gift. As Margaret opened it, she gasped. Inside was a beautiful quilt, each square showing a different scene. There was a schoolhouse, a ranch, children playing, horses running, and in the center, a house with smoke rising from the chimney and a family standing before it. "The ladies have been working on it since we heard," Mrs. Chen explained. "Each square tells part of your story." Margaret traced the careful stitches through tears. "It's beautiful. Thank you." "Thank you," Mrs. Chen said firmly, "for bringing life back to this family, for showing us all that second chances are possible." As the evening deepened and guests began to depart, each carrying leftover food and warm memories, Margaret helped tuck her children, legally hers now, the papers signed that morning, into bed. "Are you really our mama now?" Sarah asked sleepily. "Forever and always?" "Forever and always," Margaret confirmed, kissing each precious forehead. "Good," James murmured. "That's how it should be." Thomas, lingering in the doorway, cleared his throat. "I remember when Mama died," he said quietly. "I thought nothing would ever be right again, but now—" He looked at Margaret with eyes wise beyond his years. "Now I think maybe God just has different plans than we do sometimes." "I think you're right," Margaret said softly. "Good night, son." The word son lit up his face like sunrise. "Good night, Ma." Later, in the quiet of their room now, no more separate spaces, Sam held Margaret close. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing his question from weeks before. "Only one," she said, feeling him tense. "I wish I could thank whoever sent that letter. Thank them for the greatest gift I never knew I needed." Sam relaxed, chuckling into her hair. "Maybe someday we'll solve that mystery." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe we just live the thank you, every day, with every choice to love and build and grow." Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its eternal song, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. But inside the Harrison house, the future was being written in smaller moments, in children's laughter, in shared work, in the quiet breathing of a family at rest. The next morning brought chores and lessons and all the beautiful ordinary chaos of ranch life. But now Margaret met it as Mrs. Harrison, mother of 3, soon to be 4, keeper of a home that had been built on accident and sustained by choice. As she stood making breakfast, her new wedding ring catching the morning light, she heard the children stirring upstairs. Soon they'd tumble down demanding food and attention and answers to 1,000 questions. Sam would come in from the early chores, stealing a kiss and a cup of coffee before heading back out. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned in Boston, not the one promised by a mysterious letter, but the one shaped by courage and love and the wild hope of people willing to build family from the ashes of loss. "Thank you," she whispered one more time to the morning air, to Elizabeth's memory, to whatever providence had guided her here. Then she set about making biscuits, humming Sarah's letter song, ready for whatever this new day in her forever home might bring, because Margaret Harrison, teacher, mother, wife, and living proof that the best journeys have no maps, had learned the greatest lesson of all. Home isn't just where you end up, it's what you choose to build when you get there. And in a ranch house in Wyoming, where a mysterious letter had once brought a lost woman to a grieving family's door, the building continued, strong and sure and full of love, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. The children thundered down the stairs. Sam's boots sounded on the porch, and Margaret smiled. Ready for all of it. Ready for forever. Because some stories, the very best ones, never really end. They just keep growing, season by season, like the gardens she and Sarah planted, like the love that bloomed in unexpected soil, like the family that chose each other again and again, every single day. And that, Margaret thought as chaos and love filled her kitchen, was the greatest miracle of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while doing chores? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's connect over these stories of love, hope, and second chances in the American frontier.